its wars. So the actual topic itself, when I first approached Cathal to actually take on this lecture, it's the first time that I've ever actually heard those two words in the same context, seaweed and its wars. Wars and seaweed is something that I've never come across in that context. I know from an archaeology point of view, we've been eating stuff for about 10,000 years, but outside of that, that's the limit of my knowledge on it. And it's the thing about Trasnet here is that we're getting this untold story of history almost every single night of the week. So it's fantastic. And I'm sure at the end you'll have a few questions. And if you do, you can just pop them down in the comments. And I'll ask Cathal at the end, and I'm sure he'll be happy enough to answer and get any feedback he can as best he can. All right, so I'm going to hand over now to Cathal Dowd-Smith for Seaweed and its Wars. I hope you can hear me there, Cathal. You can.
I can, Ben. Thanks a million. Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here now so you can see a few images. Yeah, great. So I suppose living on an island, most of us are somewhat familiar with the old seaweed. Yeah, I suppose Ben is right in that, you know, it's been around for, you know, donkey's years, and we have a long relationship with it even as a food source, which is perhaps unsurprising, as I said, it being an island. But, you know, we're all very familiar with it, and particular, you know, at this time of quarantine, if you're like me and you're living by the coast and you're roaming the beaches every day looking for something to do, you know, the discharges of the Great Sea littered across our beaches, you know, this is the stuff that to most people is just kind of a nuisance. It's the thing on the beach you have to dodge, the smell of which kids want to avoid. It's the slimy stuff over the rock pools. I know in North Dublin here, the local council, after a big storm, go out in their big tractors, dig big holes in the beach and bury the seaweed under the sand because we just don't want it. But if you're like me and you do some gardening, and you particularly if you grow some vegetables and you try and do it organically, you might be familiar with seaweed as a great fertilizer for its potassium. But even at that, most of us probably just get it in the gloopy liquid form from the garden centre. So our relationship with it is not at all what our ancestors was. And I think when I first started looking upon this, and because it's such an obscure topic, it sort of found me. And I started looking into it. I sort of thought, gosh, knowing it from a gardening point of view, I didn't know it had such a prominent position in our agricultural history. And then when you look deeper and deeper into it, and I heard about these things called the Seaweed Wars, it was just sort of, I never realized that what we would now view as the waste of the sea, in fact, we even call it seaweed, that our ancestors just thought of it as a gem or a resource. And I suppose the crux of the story for me is the 2nd of January, 1843, when a group of men from the small, what was described as seaport fishing town of Rush. They travelled a few miles in the dead of night at 4 a.m. on a moonlit night, just after low tide. They travelled across an estuary and traversed a peninsula south and begun a task of filling horses and carts with seaweed until their misdemeanour, as it became, was uncovered. Their carts were seized, they were brought before a local magistrate. Later, a huge legal dispute that spanned several years broke up and erupted that took hold of these coastal agricultural communities on the north coast of Dublin. But also, you'll see from my research, it's actually wasn't just limited to North Dublin, although my story begins there. It was across the country, and I'll kind of touch on that briefly. But what I love about the whole story of the Seaweed Wars is it reveals so much about our island's agricultural history, our past relationship with the island, and what I'm particularly interested in is this new burgeoning discipline of environmental history, which is fascinating because it lets us into the hardships, the ingenuity, the disputes of our farmers, what they were interested in. And I suppose environmental history, for those of you that don't know, it's, as I said, it's relatively new, but it's based on the idea that nature itself is an idea, that we as humans, with a relationship with what we call the non-human world or the planet, we have come up with this idea of nature, and it has a tradition and it has a past and it has a history. of our human interaction with the planet, or the idea of nature and how that featured. And essential to the whole idea of nature and how we have become involved in it, particularly in the modern world, is this idea, the tenet of resources, that elements, natural elements from the planet, could be viewed as a supply, and as materials that could be drawn upon to have a function, naturally recurring stuff. So you're talking about everything from gold and diamonds that we see as luxuries and commodities, down to coal and oil, you know, which are a bit more common but just as valuable to the right people. You know, the exploitation of nature was central to economic expansion, particularly in the modern period. Your empires grew on the promise of exploitation of new lands, of untapped resources, and looking for new lands that had these resources to keep the economy going, and ultimately really to make profit. You know, proper management as well was a key part of this. It could turn a bog from a wilderness into a productive peatland. It could make profit from a coal seam. And seaweed, silly as it sounds, had a place amongst these 19th century resources in Ireland. And I think that our ancestors' relationship with seaweed was quite different from anywhere else in the globe. And it goes back to a number of factors, and the economic climate in Ireland, particularly in the 19th century when most of the story is. People are not unfamiliar with the subsistence lifestyle of our ancestors in the 19th century, and they lived hand to mouth. They had to make the most of their surroundings, whatever they may be. And I think seaweed is a big part of that story. So what did they understand about seaweed, and how did that understanding lead to its creation as a resource? So seaweed, or sea wrack, as far back I can go in modern time to the early 18th century, had a function. Soda alkali, which was dried seaweed, also known as kelp, dried and burned seaweed, was used in glass manufacture, in soap manufacture, and in the bleaching of linen. And it persisted much longer, the kelp industry in particular, in Northern Ireland, where the linen industry went on for much longer. Particularly the northern and eastern seaboards of Ireland had a kelp industry similar to that of Scotland. In Carnlough in County Antrim, there was a kelp shed on the quayside, and from there kelp was exported to Scotland, where there was a much greater market for it. Scotland in the United Kingdom was known as a large kelp industry, and indeed records would suggest that Northern Irish kelp was being sold as Scottish kelp because it was just better known. But even long before that, kelp industry in Ireland was much bigger, really until 1823. And the legal disputes in 1823 and the political disputes that came along with the reduction of import duties. So the government at the time decided to revoke the import duty they had imposed on Spanish barilla, which was basically Spanish kelp, which they believed was a higher product. And they wanted it for the manufacturing industry to improve the quality of the linen, particularly in the bleaching stage. So they reduced and removed eventually the tax on Spanish barilla. But the fact that there was a dispute over this shows that people were worried about it being detrimental to the Irish kelp industry, showing that there was in fact one. The salt tax was also revoked, so you could import it because it had a high quantity of salt. Even locally and traditionally, seaweed was always used medicinally. The seaweed ash was mixed with animal fat and used as an antiseptic for cuts. You know, when you think about all our gels and our creams now, when you get a little cut, this is what our ancestors were doing. In 1812, very important, was the discovery of iodine, extractable from seaweed, and at the time important for the treatment of goiters. And there was a sort of a medical industry that would have helped for a while with the survival of the kelp industry. Douglas Harper, according to him in Carnlough, he says that there was a kelp industry industry, surviving until until at least 1912, and locally in the area, there was a sort of a phrase that if you were seen going to church with a new coat or a new outfit, they might say to you, "The kelp is shining on you," you know, that you were doing well and you were profiting from what was really a cash crop. So it went on for a long time, and it clearly had value as a cash crop. Beyond the industrial uses, and when it stopped, when there were more profitable cash crops and it was abandoned by farmers really for that purpose, it was always sustained as a fertilizer, particularly in the absence of animal manure. Kelp or seaweed in particular was a very attractive fertilizer for potatoes, you know, the staple of the 19th century diet. And in the Irish Examiner in 1845, they ran a very interesting article that I'll come back to, and they talk about the importance of kelp and seaweed as a supplier of ammonia, lime, magnesium, sulfate and carbonates. But to go back to the main story and this idea of the war, really, I first came across it in the archive of Newbridge House, which is where I work. And there, the landlord, Charles Cobb, he wasn't an absentee. He was very engaged with the running of his estate, with his tenants' lives. And there's an amazing 300-year history of the landed estate there, and in particular for the 19th century. And one of the things I came across, which first highlighted to me the seriousness with which seaweed was dealt with in the 19th century, was this huge big file of papers called the Seaweed Wars. That's the title that was on it, and it's full of court summonses, draft arguments, informations, testimonies, all given in court in the 19th century, and it really is an insight into the farmer's relationship with seaweed. So there you have the great stuff. You know, you're talking about loads of this kind of stuff, a summons to bring this man Christopher Cummins before court, and what happens in this case in 1843 that really goes the length of the year and starts in the petty sessions and later goes to a higher court. The very first thing that Charles Cobb realizes he has to do is he has to prove his ownership of the land uninterrupted for a period of year. He claims title deeds dating back to Charles II. And really a lot of this is tied up in land and questions of ownership around land. Particularly a townland called Kilcray, which is a tidal estuary at low tide. Seaweed grows on this estuary and a deposit forms. And that's important that it grows and it's deposited, because in the 19th century, and indeed still today, there was a distinction between seaweed and sea wrack. Sea wrack is the stuff that the sea deposits on the shore, and seaweed is the stuff that's actually growing on the shore, on the rocks and things. And quote, it says, Mr. Cobb's tenants here, from time immemorial, had the sole and exclusive use and the employment of seaweed, which is necessary to their land as manure. So then when we come to the night of the 2nd of January 1843, you have those men from Rush who crossed the shore, the estuary, and the low tide at Rogerstown. And what they were doing here, this is the town of Rush that they would have come from, itself a small little peninsula. You've got the estuary of Rogerstown. So at low tide here, you can see they would have been able to cross the estuary, even though the fact meant that it was at 4 a.m. and the only thing they had to go by was moonlight. But they didn't just cross the estuary, but they traversed the peninsula of Donabate, going all the way around the beaches and the shore, the rocky cliffs, not stopping here at the island, but going right the way around and into and across to the townland of Kilcray, which is, I think, for me, really the remarkable thing, that at 4 a.m., 13 men cross this, what could have taken them up to an hour to complete, with horses and carts and labourers and assistants, all to help them to complete this. And they end up here in this town of Kilcray. This is the Rogerstown estuary today, and you can see there at low tide, you'd hardly be crossing at, I don't even think up to your knee. And this is what they decided to do. They were interrupted by the men of Kilcrea. So this is a close-up here of a map in the Newbridge archive, which will show you Kilcrea. It's done at the map is drawn out at the time of the railways, because they were proposing, you'll see this dotted red line, is where they were proposing to put in the rail viaduct. But at the exact same time as this planning was going on, it was the Seaweed Wars, and you can see these very helpful 4 segments mark out the tenants who held these lands, and also given by Cobb the rights to harvest seaweed across the shore here. So on the 2nd of January 1843, these tenants are woken up late at night, early in the morning, by neighbouring men from the town of Rush, who they feel are wrongly stealing their seaweed. So they go out, they confront them, they seize their carts and their horses, impound them in the local pound in Donabate, and report it to their landlord, who then orders summonses. He's also a local magistrate, so this is much easier for him to do. The men are brought before, only 3 of the men, because the rest of them, the other men were their assistants and labourers. 3 men are brought before Swords Petty Sessions for stealing. And they expressed their regret and promised not to do it again, and Cobb was happy to leave it there. It then seems that they left the courthouse and went straight to the local pub in Donabate. In the course of their imbibing, one of the men at the bar declares to the landlord of the public house that he wasn't in the habit of stealing seaweed, and to quote, he expressed his intention of going again in larger force to carry off seaweed and impose resistance from any of the Kilcrea men. So he wasn't deterred by this. He felt he was fully entitled to go back and harvest more seaweed from what was a very tidal shore. I mean, there was a lot of seaweed growing. Exactly 2 weeks later, so again at another low tide, 5 a.m., still strong moonlight, another farmer, Thomas Dick, who's further down into Kilcrea, he's about here, he's interrupted at 5 a.m. and he goes down to the shore, and there he sees the Rush men, where Dick is a sort of a peace-abiding, law-abiding man and doesn't want to cause any chaos. But the Rush men responded to his accusations, and they said they would lose their lives sooner than part with the seaweed. To me, when I first read that, I thought that was remarkable. Here are these men actually willing to give up their lives for this seaweed, this fertilizer, which obviously goes back to their reliance on the fertilizer for their crop of potatoes, which they were living off of. Dick retired for the night, and a breach of peace did not occur, and they got away with their carts full of seaweed. Cobb, meanwhile, in the background, went back to his fellow magistrates and got more summonses for the men to appear at Swords again. The 3rd instance of seaweed theft, 2 days after these men in Rush had received their summonses for court, they returned to Kilcrea. Again, this more than an hour-long journey all the way around the peninsula, through the waters, their horses, their cars, and started to fill them up. The constable, in his testimony in court, calls it a whole concourse. They number about 45 men from Rush. This must have been a whole clearance of seaweed. They were going, they were hungry for the stuff, and they were really carrying buckets of it away. It was what erupted into a violent attack. When it's described, you can't help but feel comedy in it, for the fact that it's described that the Rushmen were piling the seaweed into their carts, while on the other side of the cart, the Kilcrea men were emptying the carts. So there was this kind of, it almost appears comedic to me, until 2 men are then arrested by the local police constable for assault. So it clearly, got a lot worse and a lot more serious, and not because it's the 3rd instance and it continues for the rest of the year. It stops looking like a petty squabble between neighbours, and it starts looking like this is a war, really. This is why it's got this name. It's economic, it's legal, it's now going to a higher court. It goes on through the months of February and into March. Moonlit early mornings. Again, on the 13th of March, the Rush men cross the shores and the peninsula into Kilcrea. A different Kilcrea farmer, Lynch, you'll see him here on the map, he goes down to confront 16 Rushmen stealing from his shore. One of the Rushmen threatens him with a fork, holds it up against his body, and threatens to enter the fork into his body. But this time, Lynch did not recognize these Kilcray men. What had been interesting before is that the Kilcray men were always able to identify the Rush farmers, but now all of a sudden they can't. So clearly it's growing legs and it's happening further. Behind the scenes, Cobb, the landlord, who's ultimately the owner of these shores and responsible for them and wants to protect his tenants, farmers, he's digging around seeking legal advice. He refers to a case in Balbriggan a few years previous when they refer to a patent from the Crown. And this patent dates back to the time of Charles II, when he did not specify that seaweed in this patent was given to a landowner. So therefore, the presumption is that the Crown still possesses the title and holds it for the public at large. So anybody is entitled to go and harvest seaweed of the shore because it belongs to the Crown. Now, Charles Cobb begins to dispute this on the basis that at the time in the 17th century, they did not understand the function and the value of seaweed. And he says that little of Ireland was in tillage, i.e. this was before the agricultural revolution. And quote, otherwise sterile sandbanks to which seaweed is exclusively applied would have been the last to be cultivated. So they weren't even cultivating the coastal regions. So basically what Charles Cobb is telling us here is that it's not really until the 1840s that seaweed becomes such a valuable crop as a fertilizer. No doubt they were also eating it as well. But if the Rushmen get hold of this information that it's the Crown's to give to the people, this is ammunition for them to continue. And it certainly seems that later in the 19th century, they possessed these legal facts and they continued undeterred. They also refer to, which for me is very interesting, the instance of a coal frigate in 1812 that was wrecked on these shores. And Charles Cobb places a guard around this shipwreck. The crew have drowned. It's loaded still with coal. It was probably headed from Malahide Harbour. The custom men from Malahide, which is the next largest town just south of Kilcray here, the custom men are coming to claim this shipwreck and all the coal on it, because obviously it would have had to have paid custom on it. But Cobb is able to maintain possession of it because it's shipwrecked on his shore, and there was legal rights for this, that anything actually wrecked onto your shore was your possession, and he was able for 2 weeks to maintain a guard, and he got possession of this frigate. So certainly he's using this to explain that the sea wreck is his, and what they say, they refer to it as between the high shore and the shore. So basically everything in the tidal zone of the shoreline is Cobb's. What's also very interesting is that Cobb learns this in the process of this legal dispute from talking to his tenants, but that these tenants in particular in Kilcray were actually cultivating seaweed. This is the ingenuity I was talking about. They were placing large boulders from high in the estuary to further down where it was more tidal. And a boulder moved from high shore into mid shore, took 2 years, and it started to grow seaweed on it. And indeed, they were also taking rocks and boulders from the land and placing them on the shore. And as the tide would come in and out, a land rock, it would take 5 years before it would start producing seaweed. But Cobb certainly believes legally that because these men are actually cultivating and growing seaweed, it has more legal right, because it's something that they're producing themselves, and theft of which is a bit more of a serious crime. interestingly as well, you know, the industrial revolution, the agricultural revolution, the burgeoning of science, and the scientific research that's going in behind the agricultural revolution. You know, what did these farmers understand of seaweed, and how did it change during this time? You know, they knew it was a good fertilizer, but did they really understand why? And I go back to the 26th of February 1845 with an interesting article published in the Farmers' Gazette and republished in the Irish Examiner, which had a much wider readership. And they talk about in great detail the chemical properties of seaweed. So clearly it's being investigated scientifically. It talks about that until then, farmers believed that it was the salt in the seaweed that was actually fertilizing their crops. And the article disputes this, saying that how could it be the salt? Because any of these lands near the shore, where there was sea vapor, water vapor, which contains salt, it would have been carried in by wind over the shore, and it would have fertilized the land. So the salt was already being brought in, and that would have made the seaweed redundant as a fertilizer. So clearly there was something else. So they go in and they give a detailed breakdown of the components of seaweed. And they highlight ammonia as the key ingredient. And what's kind of interesting is that they say that the stench of rotting seaweed, because it is like the stench of rotting flesh, it's because it shares the ammonia. And that's where the science is behind them at the middle of the 19th century. They list potassium, but they haven't yet arrived at the conclusion that it's the potassium and the potash that are helping the potatoes and really producing the potatoes. The article goes on to encourage farmers who, and I quote, have seaweed within their reach and who may formerly not have considered it worth gathering, end quote, to do so. But interestingly for me, it makes no reference to any legal disputes arising at that time over the right to harvest seaweed. It doesn't talk about what's going on in the other papers and in the other pages of the same newspaper, which is endless references to disputes, people arriving in court in places from Spiddal, Tralee, Milltown, County Clare, Skibbereen, Carlingford, and Rosnakill, County Donegal. People all over Ireland are being brought into court similarly around the same time. You're talking maybe 4 years here, there's a real rush in them. So the Seaweed Wars, I'm not just talking about this one tiny minute instance in North County Dublin. I'm just using this to show what actually the newspapers detail is going on across the country. So clearly the farmers are saying they have much more seaweed, they're not using it, you know, and tapping into the ingenuity of other farmers where they're, like in Kilcrea, cultivating their own seaweed, and other people from other townlands coming along to avail of it. The landlords have a strong sense that this isn't fair. And from studying the different estates and the different coastal landlords' responses to this, it's interesting how you know, the regionality of Ireland and how the different landlords are dealing with it differently. So the case on Rosnakill in County Donegal, for example, that's on Lord Leitrim's Donegal estate. Lord Leitrim, interestingly, commonly known as the Wicked Earl, was assassinated later in 1878. So around North Fanad Peninsula and Meva, Lord Leitrim charged his tenants $1 a year to harvest as much seaweed from the shoreline as they could. The idea behind this was that it wasn't just like here in Cobb's estate, it wasn't just the tenants who had land bordering the sea who got to avail of the benefits of seaweed, but it was all tenants. So even inland tenants could go to the shoreline and harvest seaweed, and those who bordered the coast were not just entitled to that portion. So it was shared equally among the estate and the tenants. And indeed, Lord Leitrim believed that the seaweed below high water mark, so between the shore and the tide break, was his. So it's not like they're going wading into the ocean or out in boats harvesting mountains of seaweed. They might have been, but certainly Leitrim isn't charging them for that. And he specifies that his aims are to regulate the benefits of seaweed for his tenants. And also you get the sense that it's to deter them from considering this is their right. You know, Leitrim is making the case here that he owns the land, he owns the wreck on the shore. He's for the price giving you the right to harvest seaweed. And the value of this resource is mirrored in Leitrim's dogged determination to enforce the charges. 2 weeks before he was assassinated, he has recorded that there were no more than 12 quit notices on his Donegal estate, all of which were for tenants who had been served because they had refused to pay for the seaweed. So the fact that he had to impose this charge was because people were disputing him over this, and that this led to the court case in Rossnakill. It actually arose because he built a wall over a rabbit warren, but the wall, as a side effect, was stopping some of the men getting to a certain part of the shore where they were harvesting seaweed. The result of it was they broke a gap through the wall to go down to harvest from the shore. Shortly after that, Leitrim dies. Really interestingly, and the climax of the political status of seaweed that I've located is during the discussions for the Irish Land Bill in 1870. Sir John Gray, who was the MP for Kilkenny, considered that a landlocked county, and Gray was also the owner of the nationalist newspaper, the Freeman's Journal. He attacks the Ulster landlord and the Marquess of Dufferin and Ava in the House of Commons. Gray stands up and he accuses Dufferin of claiming possession, and I quote, "even the waste thrown up by the waves." So Gray is saying out in Westminster, this guy is a crazy savage landlord. He's even charging his tenants for what is the waste thrown up by the waves. Lord Dufferin is then forced to stand up in the House of Lords and make clear, it's kind of a bit damning to Gray, nearly. Dufferin says if the honourable member knew anything, he would know that in fact seaweed was very, very valuable resource to the people of Ireland, particularly to the farmers. He spoke very highly of seaweed, and he called it a very valuable property for his tenants on the Clandeboyne estate north of Strangford Lough. And he told them that he reserved the seaweed for the interests of all the tenantry, so that it may be enjoyed by them all, instead of, and I quote, being monopolised and wasted by the one or two tenants whose farms lay along the seashore. So here it is being spoken about in the House of Lords, which is really high political level if you think about it. This is the 19th century approach to seaweed. So one of the other things that struck me when I was always doing the research on this is how once you start looking for something that pops up everywhere. Again, maps to do with the railway. Here they are marking out the seaweed. You can see it quite clearly there. And the problem with the arrival of the railway was it created a viaduct and it cut off the estuary at Malahide. So this cultivation of seaweed died out, particularly in Kilcrea. And it was no longer tidal, so it wasn't growing. They couldn't go down there and harvest it anymore. So the revolution that Irish land went through in the 19th century, the changes, the industrialization, the introduction of railway, all this kind of stuff, a lot of this is responsible for why seaweed, we don't generally think of it today as it was this really valuable resource. And also what comes up a lot, and particularly for me as an art historian, is its appearance, its cultural representation. You know, songs about seaweed, poems about seaweed, and as well artistic depictions of seaweed. You know, all these artists, you know, tired of painting pictures of sleepy landscapes and seascapes. You know, if you knew when the men were going down to start harvesting their seaweed, you know, after a big storm when the shore is flooded with seaweed, or, you know, maybe it's a ritualistic thing, they do it at a certain time of the year, probably to harvest their crops at a certain time of the day in a local community. You could be like Nathaniel Hone the Younger here. It's energetic, it's a bit of interest for your scene, it's life, it's character, there's horses, there's carts. And this is just a rough sketch in the collection of the National Gallery. But if you go on, a more realistic depiction here by Kavanagh, and Kavanagh, you know, a lot of people who would have studied in northern France at the time, there's a lot of seaweed and kelp industry in Brittany. and in Spain and in North France. So they would have seen this as well, and they brought it back to Ireland. And it's a part of a a romantic school of painting, people who work with the land, and people who are showing a connection. And what better way in a coastal community to show connection with the earth, with nature, than men going around harvesting seaweed, but also the drama of it. You're talking about people really out in the harshest of weathers. This is happening all over the island of Ireland. So no matter where you are on the coast, with the ass and the baskets over the side of it, with the big cart loaded high full of the seaweed, men, women, children, all out on the shore gathering up all the different types of seaweed, in large quantities for agricultural uses, like here in Sutton, which would have been quite a big tillage area where they were using seaweed, to Connemara and West of Ireland communities where we know they were eating it and using it medicinally. Here by Paul Henry, this donkey, it's got color, it's got energy, all created by the seaweed. You can feel the load on its back. But anybody who actually uses seaweed to manure land, it breaks down in an instant. So if you're doing a field, you're going to need an awful lot of seaweed to load up a serious crop of potatoes. So the size and the scale, I don't think here is exaggerated. These poor animals really weighed down by these collections from the shore, and there's an energy to it as well. John Milton Synge was writing for the Congested Districts Board in the early 19th century, in the early 20th century, 1900s. He was writing about the conditions in the west of Ireland and the poor, and he got Jack B. Yeats to illustrate it for him, and this is one of the drawings he did. Look at this man right out in the middle of the shore, collecting seaweed straight out of the sea, the tide crashing in, the horse diligently, loyally standing by, the cart getting higher and higher, the color, the energy. This is the kind of the thing that the artists at the time loved. This is man really at the interface with nature, and interacting with the environment. And it's a real insight into Ireland, the agricultural community, and the humble farmer. Again, though, it's slightly romantic. From viewing pictures like this and this, you're getting a sense of Ireland in the early 20th century, but you're not getting connotations of a contested resource, of a thing that people fought over, that men were willing to sacrifice their lives for, or at least say that they were going up in court merely 60 years before. So there's a cultural artistic idea, but there's also this more serious earlier legal economic fight over it. So I suppose then, just to start to wrap up, where are we with the men in Rush in 1843? It's getting into the autumn and into the winter, and they've got a big court case coming up. It's going on. Judge Crampton is leading the case. Cobb is determined to clearly make an example out of them. Sir Roger Palmer, who is the landlord in Rush, who's an absentee, who's based in London for most of the year, is writing letters that October to Cobb to say, listen, the men are really sorry, they've expressed guilt to me, will you not just stand down and let them go? Palmer is obviously finding this a bit embarrassing. If this kind of stuff is making it into the newspaper and known locally, it's a bit of a reflection upon him as a landlord, and indeed he's an absentee one. So he's saying to Cobb, would you not just kind of, like, these men have apologized, would you not just let it go? But Cobb is clearly dogged, and he wants to make an example out of this and bring it all the way through to the court. The men are then forced to change their plea. They go for guilty. They announce their remorse once again, and the judge sort of leaves it at that and doesn't sentence them or fine them. These are poor farmers. They don't have huge holdings, and again, subsistence living. And there's a bit of recognition that these men are just trying to eke out a life for themselves. So they're let go, but the judge sort of says, we hope that this will stand as an example and discourage anybody else going this way. You're talking no more than 12 years, and this is a problem again. change of generation, hardly. It's still in memory. And there's more disputes over seaweed again. And again, at the centre of it are these rushmen. For me, I think a lot of it has to do with the conditions of their estate and the estate management. The Palmer estate is not recorded, at least not in Ireland. There's no available records that I've been able to find to give an indication of how the estate was managed or the problems of the tenants. But north and south of Rush, you have two very well managed estates. You've got Lord Holmpatrick's estate north in Milverton and Skerries, where he's also charging for the collection of seaweed. And he eventually is forced to build a wall to stop the men from Rush coming forward to steal the seaweed that he's charging his tenants for. And south of Rush, then you've got Cobb, who's clearly very proactive in the agricultural welfare of his farmers. So I think a lot of it has to do with grievances that are deep seated in the farmers, grievances with their own landlord. 1869, then, letters from Mooney, who seems to have been an agent for Palmer in Rush, and he refers to the Rushmen, and I quote, and others along the coast who have combined to oppose the owners of land bordering the shore. So, you're getting into the land wars, you're getting into the land movement, taking off the late 19th century, and foremost in the Rush farmers' minds is the rights to harvest seaweed. That's what the land wars seem to be to them on the ground. So this is something that goes on, and clearly you can see from the artistic representations that seaweed harvesting was going on until the 20th century. Industrially, kelp was being produced in small coastal communities, particularly on the northern eastern seaboards, for years. Well up until the 1890s, it was a very worthwhile cash crop until later things start to come in place of it. There were, for a brief period, iodine factories in Galway and Donegal. But then cheaper deposits from Chile came in and they just flooded the market. And in Ireland, they didn't survive. In 1930, Thomas Dillon, a chemist, noted, and I quote, notwithstanding the competition from Chile and the restricted market, there is an iodine factory in every kelp producing country in the whole world except Ireland. Dillon goes on to sort of suggest economically to the Free State government that it would be advantageous to open iodine factories, particularly in Galway, where seaweed harvesting is still going on. And he says, and I quote, yet we find that seaweed, which in Ireland is scarcely regarded as worthy of attention, is in Brittany an additional source of wealth to the maritime population. Free State Ireland, De Valera came into government in 1932, did not pursue this as far as I can find out. They looked briefly into a report, the possibility of industrially harvesting seaweed from iodine manufactory, but they just don't go there. Perhaps they're influenced by this cultural representation of seaweed as, the poverty of the farmer of the west of Ireland, eking an existence from the sea, the hardship with the relationship. In building a modern Ireland, they want to move away from this cultural nationalism, and they want to go somewhere different, somewhere new, somewhere foreign. They must have been influenced by some stage, because you can see in the national collections in our national galleries that seaweed was quite well depicted for the coastal communities. So I hope that's just a bit of an insight into something that you probably haven't thought about before, that you weren't really aware of, that had such a rich history for most of our ancestors. It's the first time I've really given a serious talk on this, so very interested to hear about it. If people have stories, if they know of other references to it. It's one of these kind of things that once you start looking into it, it's everywhere and you can't get away from it. As I say, all around the coast of Ireland, and the story is different everywhere. In different communities, their relationship varies from the islands to, as I say, Strangford Lough, big industrial area, where they were more seriously manufacturing and producing kelp, and to all these other pocket communities and the different landlords and their different responses. It's really interesting. So thanks very much, everyone, and I hope that was something different and something interesting. So back over to you, Ben, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have to say, when you say something interesting, something we haven't heard before, like the way in which you've approached it, from not only looking at it from a local perspective in the community, but then taking it on politically, and then obviously culturally, nationally, and then for it to end up in the House of Lords. I mean, it's an incredible, I mean, that is really something. I mean, I've never, in all my years of taking on history, I've never come across the like of it. And it really is, even the title itself, the Seaweed Wars, it has such a book about it. I think you could be in for a long haul with this one.
It's something that there's a lot left to really understand, because just putting out the feelers when you're starting to do the research and you're going down the legal side of it, you're going down the political, it's in the newspapers, the medical, the scientific, there's a lot to it, yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff, comments coming through to me. And to be fair to you, you've answered pretty much all of them. There was one particular comment about the east-west divide, but like you've touched on that, saying that it's a national thing. It's not just located to the east of the country. We've one there about just wondering what the impact in terms of the potato blight was, and the famine in the estates that you've mentioned, and just saying it's a very interesting subject, and well done.
Yeah, well, the famine is obviously particularly interesting, and there's one account that I came across of a traveller who's going through Ireland in the middle of the famine, an American woman, and she's going through Mayo, and she comes with a I think it's a priest is showing her some of the poverty and during the famine, and they come across this guy basically going over a mountain with this huge bag or this huge basket on his back full of seaweed. And he's got hardly any clothes on him. He probably hasn't eaten in ages, but he's still fertilizing what little remains of his crop. This is 45, so it's before the crop had seriously failed again in 46, so they were still holding out hopes. But I'm sure if you found later references to it, you'd find people eating it much more seriously. And earlier famines in the or at least not famines, but bad crop harvests in the 1830s and 40s, I think would have really hammered home the seriousness of the seaweed as a fertilizer to the Rushmen in particular, because like in the real nitty-gritty of looking at it, the Rushmen are subsistence living. They're small farms, their families dependent on the crop. Whereas in Donabate and the Newbridge estate with Cobb, as I said, it's much more controlled landlording system. They've got better size holdings, and they're mixed farms. So they're doing a bit of tillage to sell, and they're also doing crops to eat themselves. And there's animals in there as well. So that has some basis to do with it as well. I think a lot of the reliance is reflected in the seriousness with which they challenge and seek to gather. Why they're willing to say things like they'll sacrifice their lives for this, and why they'll go to court over it, is because how dependent they were on it as a food fertilizer and possibly as a foodstuff.
I suppose that kind of leads on. There's another question from Liam O'Sullivan here. It's kind of touching on that east-west divide. He's wondering if you've come across anything on how seaweed helped to fertilize the isles off the west coast, for example, Achill.
Oh yeah, hugely important. In Achill, in Rathlin Island as well, which had a long community in the 19th century, quite a big community. Kelp production was basically what they were known for. But yeah, Achill, particularly the islands of Cork as well, very big for harvesting and fertilizing seaweed. And these are and particularly in the communities, subsistence farming, where people aren't keeping animals. So their only form of fertilizer is seaweed. And at the same time, which is something I haven't really gone into, guano is coming onto the market from the New World, from South America and America. This magic product, it's sold as in the newspapers as fertilizer. So there's a move away from seaweed in more serious agriculture, in mass farming, in landlords who are taking over. So the Scottish kelp industry and the Scottish seaweed harvesting for a fertilizer industry is dying because guano is flooding the British market. So that has a big impact in rural Ireland. And then at a later stage, you're talking the 8 Sing years in the early 20th century, it's the islands who are reliant on just the seaweed. You know, so the poor communities are left with the seaweed if you have it, you know, later down the scale.
And I suppose there's another, this one particularly interesting from my point of view anyway. Anna Carolina Distel, she's saying that there must be a lot of vocabulary lost in terms of trade with the Irish language, that we might, in terms of trade in seaweed or possibly dealing with seaweed, that maybe now that it's, you know, fallen by the wayside, that's been lost through time. I'm not something I have some answers.
Yeah, I definitely think so. You know, the names would be fascinating to look into, you know, the translation. You know, in the English it's seaweed. It's the weed of the sea, you know, and in Ireland, yeah, we have terms for seaweed in general, but these people knew the difference between the different seaweeds, and they were different terms, and they were just as strong as the other. And you know, the good ones for eating, the good ones for the medical uses, the good ones for the kelp. The kelp industry, if you look into it, was amazingly sophisticated in the way that they built the kilns to burn it, in the way they harvested it to reduce the sand and the salt in it, and the songs around it. Doulamon is a great song. If you want to look it up on YouTube, the UCD choral scholars sing a great version of it, which is kind of like a romantic love for seaweed between a man and woman. Poetry, a lot of poetry around seaweed, and then again the artistic. Yeah, so I think in the language there must have been a lot around it.
I suppose this one's a fine one. We're getting a load of really good comments in, just from people saying how blown away they are by never ever heard of seaweed and war. I think it's really opened people's eyes. So you really have made an impact on people here. The last one I'll challenge you with is, they're trying to kind of, someone's asking, what do you think this, or how does this inform our cultural narrative in terms of what we already know? What does this bring to it that's not already there?
I suppose, for me, it was, you know, they talk of the cliche for the historian, the window into the past. This wasn't a window. This was a hand-holding exercise across the beaches and the shores for me. This was detail. You know, we always knew that the Irish farmer, the subsistence living, working with the land, you know, you kind of had this romantic, you know, vision of your ancestors doing this. But this is the detail of it. This is how it was done. And so there's the close relationship. I hope the Rush case, the reason I've really followed it here is because of the seriousness with which they pursue the harvesting of seaweed. They're not just going to give this up after one attempt, 6 in barely 3 months, 45 men. So there's that. What always strikes me is the regionality of it. How in every landed estate, it's different. Depended on the landlord, depended on the tenants, depended on the area, the coastal communities. That the MP who doesn't understand it is from Kilkenny. That in the islands and on the coastal communities, they have a completely different relationship with it. The estuaries and how they're growing it. They're the communities who sell it to their neighbours inland. So there's the regionality of it. And I think what we've really lost is what I started with, is that to us it's just seaweed. It's just smelly stuff on the shore that you tell the kids not to touch and go away from. And it's the stuff the council are now burying. But I mean, there's nothing to stop you if you're like me growing potatoes. Go out and harvest the seaweed. It's the best stuff. It's the freest stuff. It's the most organic stuff. You can go out and harvest it, but you can't cut it. You can cut it, but you can't tear the rocks asunder. You don't need to be cutting it because there's enough on the shore. The big problem I'm finding at the minute is, after the seaweed is degraded, my soil is full of plastic because the shores are littered with plastic now. And to me, this is clearly going to affect the seaweed. It's going to suffer. You know, so that's the thing about, you know, the environment. You know, we're not looking after it at all like our ancestors were. You know, and down to their reliance on it, you know, and a bit of us need to get back to that, you know, respecting our environment, the nature, but also, you know, learning to live with it. And that's the big thing about this idea of nature. You know, we're a part of nature. The humans aren't it's not humans and nature. We're in it. You know, we're all a part of this ecosystem. So I think plastic in seaweed is just the tip of the iceberg, really. I don't think that sort of answers it.
Bring you onto that one there, finish up on this one. With someone who's very interested in what you mentioned to start with, the whole thing of environmental history, and that's something, a term that they've never heard before. And the question that comes afterwards is, have you got a book, or will you be having a book, or where do you go from here? And can people follow you and donate to your cause?
Well, there's a lot of research to be done yet. There's a fair bit. If you're interested in environmental history, there's an American journal called Environmental History, which is great. There's also an online forum, and I think it's called Environmental and Society or something. But they're short articles, 300 words, I think, about peer reviewed, and they cover everything, and it's global. And that's the great thing about environmental history, it's global. So while you're talking about the men harvesting on the shore in Kilcrea and the north coast of Dublin and on the island of Ireland, there's parallels to be drawn with what they're doing in Guinea and, you know, Australia and wherever. So there's a huge global movement behind the environmental history discipline. And if you're just Googling environmental history, you'll come up with a lot really burgeoning, particularly in America, really burgeoning. And it's eye-opening, to say the least. Where I'm going with it, I don't know. Not yet.
All right, that's fair enough. I won't push you any further on that one.
Well, I can't escape it anyway. It's haunting me, and it keeps popping up everywhere. So I'll just have to keep going with it for a while.
There you go, no choice. But look, I have to say, genuinely, that was absolutely enthralling. I really, really enjoyed it. I mean, not only have you come at it from every angle, it's transverse in our culture, our poetry, our songs, our politics, our struggles. It seems to be almost like a kind of an emblem for everything that's already gone before. And I think you're into a real new journey on this one. So I really thanks very much for coming on to Trasnet here tonight. And you can see from the comments and the questions there that people are really engaged about what you're doing. So thanks very much for tuning in. So for everyone out there, for Trasnet here, again, thanking Cathal Dowd-Smith. This will be on YouTube again for tomorrow. If anyone hasn't seen, you can share it, and definitely, as we've seen here now, is another untold history story again here in Trasnet here. So we have a great week coming up ahead. Tomorrow night we have the Military Archives, Early Years by Commandant Daniel Adiotis. Wednesday the 6th, we have Astronomical Observations at Stone Age Sites by Martin Byrne. On Thursday the 7th, we have the 1916 Executions by author and historian Derek Molyneux. And then on Friday the 8th, we have Tales from Ireland's Fairy Forts by the one and only Eddie Lenihan. So thank you all very much for tuning in tonight. Tá súgan go leir slán sa bhaile, tuaire agus cíb níos rí sibh tuaire slán slán.